We're going to look at federal policy. We just talked about policy in our last lesson, and basically that's where you try to find a solution to a problem. So now we're going to look at federalism and how it applies to a couple situations. In this case, first, education. Remember, education is supposed to be a reserved power for the states, but because policy around education is something that people deeply care about around the country, and it's debated pretty vigorously, the national government has gotten involved, and they do that through grants, and they're going to offer money to the states and then say, hey, if you don't take it, then we're going to if you take it, you're going to have to do X, Y, or Z. So that's how they kind of worked their way into state policy. So let's just look at this. A couple of examples here. Flip over to the back side of the card. I want you to do something different. I want you to make a line down the middle of the card. On the left-hand side, put No Child Left Behind Act 2002. This was President Bush, although he had bipartisan support. And on the right-hand side, you're going to have a Common Core 2010, and that was President Obama, also with bipartisan support. So both these had support from people in both parties. They weren't partisan actions, but they both kind of do a little bit different stuff. And as you'll see here, and this is just an example of how federalism is working, and how, in this case, it's this national government kind of forcing down onto the states in an area where the Constitution doesn't allow them to, but they do because the states are going to take money from them. All right, so let's go through. All right, it's a federal law. All right, federal law, so national law, No Child Left Behind. And the big thing it did, and if you go back 20 years ago, this was like a big push through states and the government, was accountability tests for all students. And so every kid was going to have to take some sort of test to make sure they were learning. And that's kind of falling out of favor recently, but it's still a big deal, because the idea was that you want to make sure kids are learning, and if they're not, then there's going to be some sort of punishment for that at the school level. The other big thing that it did is it said teachers must be highly qualified, and I put that in quotes because that's actually what it said. And highly qualified really meant that you were teaching a subject that you had a degree in. That was the big part. You were qualified to do it, or you took some sort of test that said you were qualified to teach that. So you didn't have like a PE teacher teaching algebra, which, by the way, could have happened prior. They could put you just about anything, and that doesn't work well. We know from research that people that have degrees in the subject area are going to be better at teaching it, and the students learn better than a class that's taught by someone who doesn't have a degree in it and has no background. And that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, if you don't know much about it, you're probably not going to be great at teaching it. All right. And if you don't do it, if you don't do this and have the testing and show the federal government, and the federal government's going to keep track, then you lost your funding that the federal government had been giving out for years. So everybody did it. All right. Carrot and stick, or mostly stick. All right, Common Core is going to change that. No Child Left Behind wasn't super popular, especially among schools. And so this is a little different approach to try to improve education. So President Obama, his idea actually started at the state level with a bunch of governors, and a bipartisan group of governors developed standards. They said, you know what, the states are going to come up with learning metrics, like things that students are supposed to learn. So they developed this. And then the attempt was to have the same standards in all schools. Every kid will be learning the same thing in every school. That's the idea. And matter of fact, I had this little cartoon that I thought was funny. And he had all the kids with the Common Core helmet, and they're all kind of like zoned out. And then the Dr. Common Core is saying, these kids aren't the same. Can't you see that diversity? Boom. And of course, what they're learning is not diverse. They're all learning the exact same thing. That's kind of the joke behind it. All right. And so the Common Core is a little different. Instead of saying, if you don't do this, you lose funding, instead there was incentives from the federal government if you adopted it. So if you adopted it, then you got money. All right. So you didn't have to do it. And there were some states that didn't. But if you don't adopt it, then you just don't get money. It's not if you don't do it, you will lose money. It was if you do it, you get more. So it was a little different, carrot stick approach of the federal government. But this is how the federal government gets involved in issues that are supposed to be reserved to the states according to the Constitution. Now all of a sudden the federal government has a lot of sway in. Here's where Common Core stands now. You can see this map. Anytime you see a map and it has like a policy and some difference in between states, that's federalism. All right. Um, the states in red had adopted Common Core, but then have changed it. The yellow, Minnesota got rid of it. The gray never had it. There were 4 states that never had it: Nebraska, Texas, Alaska, and Virginia. And mostly because those states had their own state standards, and so they didn't think Common Core was better. All right, so that's where Common Core is. All right, cool. That's education. And so I put in Virginia here for us. Virginia said no to Common Core, and so it's never really been much of an issue in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I should say, because they've had their own standards, the standards of learning. All right, cool. Done with that. Next. All right, second piece of policy that we're going to look at is federal powers after September 11th. And this really has to do with like phones, computers, and your email, and how safe that is from the government prying and looking into it. And so after September 11th, people were really scared. And so the federal government passed a massive law called the PATRIOT Act that is going to get them involved in people's lives a lot more than probably anybody wanted. All right, here we go. So U.S. Patriot Act. You can go ahead and write that at the top on the back, nice and big on the back. USA Patriot Act. Now, by the way, I'm going to show you something. Well, it actually is an acronym. Do not write this. Okay, listen right here. Do not write this. This is like just for me to, I kind of think it's funny, so I'm going to show it. All right, so this is what the actual acronym stands for. Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. Like literally someone in Congress, like some staffer for a congressperson, like came up with that. It's like, okay, great. Awesome. I love the cartoon on the left, which has Google, and then like the O's are the eyes of like a federal government, like the feds. I love that. All right, that's fun. All right, so you should have Patriot Act at the top. Good. Let me just remind you before we jump into what it is. You don't have to write this, but just a reminder of what the Fourth Amendment is, if you don't remember this from U.S. history or you have never learned it, and we will. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, their houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures shall not be violated. No warrant shall be issued, but upon probable cause supported by an oath and affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the things to be seized. So, yeah, that's the Fourth Amendment. So, like, you should be your papers, your effects, your things. You should feel safe against an unreasonable search and seizure. And so, what does the Patriot Act do? Okay, here we go. Now you're writing. Bullet point. It allowed the government to search emails, phone records without a warrant. So the question is, with the Fourth Amendment, is email the new version of your papers? Eventually, the Supreme Court will rule yes, to some extent anyway. Phone records can also be kept, and they can do that without warrant. And when I say phone records, I mean like who you called, not necessarily what was said. They still can't like actually listen to you without going to the court and getting a warrant, but they could actually collect all your phone numbers that you called. And so if you called some place that was, had terrorist ties, then that might make you, they might go to court and then get to wiretap you at that point, because you may be suspected because you're talking to someone in a country that has terrorist ties. All right. This is kind of funny. Here's Ben Franklin saying a quote that he said: "Those who would sacrifice freedom for security deserve neither." By the way, sit around with some friends someday and just talk about that wisdom, that wise statement. Those who would sacrifice freedom for security deserve neither. And then here's the NSA, National Security Agency, which by the way was created to try to keep terrorists from blowing up the United States, and they are watching and listening to everything to try to gather data. They say, get this guy's phone and email records. Love it. Well, Ben Franklin. Of course, the irony in that is that there were no phones and emails when Ben Franklin said this, but that's the fun part, right? All right. They probably would have suspected old Ben Franklin. He was kind of crazy. All right. All right. So search financial records without a warrant. It allowed them to do that. They could look at your bank records, see if there was any funny deposits in your bank. And the question is your financial records part of your papers, and therefore this is going against the Fourth Amendment. Search your home without your knowledge. Generally, they had to present a warrant and then go in. This allowed them to go get the warrant and then show up when you weren't even there. So that's problematic with the Patriot Act. And again, all of this is predicated on protecting us, that security issue. I want to be protected, so I'm going to let the government have more power. And that's very typical that happens in times of fear and war. Definitely, this Patriot Act has been rewritten, by the way, and the court has thrown out parts of it as well since this time, because we're now 20 years almost past September 11th. Wiretap the phone without cause. So you could wiretap the phone without much cause. You just say, "Hey, we need this one." So you don't really have to provide evidence. You don't have to have oath or affirmation that the person actually is a problem. So it just really allows the government, to get access things that it couldn't access prior. And then the thing that really ticked off the public when they heard about this back a few years ago was that the government was collecting mass data. And that meant basically any phone or email records were all saved on a server. And then at any time, the National Security Agency, the NSA, could basically just search and find anything that you did. All right. Now, phone, again, it wasn't that they could hear what you said, but they knew who you called. And then email records similar as well. So again, as I said, the Patriot Act has been rewritten, and some of the stuff has been removed because of the outrage that the public had over it, and then also the Supreme Court has thrown out parts of it as well. All right, so there's examples of the federal government getting involved in policy, and that are very controversial. And all right, so you got to study these, make sure you know these, make sure you understand them, and we'll go from there. Thanks, guys.